Hi, welcome back to Case Brief's LSAT course. My name is Sean Murphy. Today is Lesson 10. We're going to talk about flawed reasoning questions. With flawed reasoning, we come to the heart of LSAT logic. We've been strengthening and weakening and finding assumptions for bad arguments. Now we're going to talk about reasoning in the abstract. Here's where the LSAT gets the most philosophical and, in my opinion, the most fun. We're going to start with June 2007, Section 2. Take a look at number 4. Pause the video and try this one on your own. The conclusion is that Oxenfrey's prepackaged meals really are nutritious. Why? Because those who say they're not nutritious are biased. They are anti-Oxenfrey. The report that said Oxenfrey is bad for you is put out by Danto Foods, and they're an Oxenfrey rival. Now, it's interesting to note when someone is biased, but it's not considered good reasoning. The proper way to challenge an argument is to challenge its assumptions or its evidence or its reasoning. You don't win an argument by saying you're wrong because you're biased, or you're wrong because you're bad, or I'm right because I'm good. That is poor reasoning. And it's a very common LSAT flaw. Generally, this category of flaw is called a source argument, where you don't attack the evidence or the reasoning, you attack the person making the argument or the source of the argument. You may have heard the phrase ad hominem. It's a phrase in Latin that just means to the man, meaning that you attack the person and not the argument. So, the correct answer is A. Treats evidence that there is an apparent bias as evidence that the Connerly report's claims are false. Bias does not imply falsity. It's fine to be skeptical, but that doesn't mean that your opposing argument is wrong. The other answer choices: B, draws a conclusion based solely on an unrepresentative sample of Oxenfrey's products. There's actually no specific products in the argument. There's only the information given in the report from the opposing side. So it's definitely not B. C, fails to take into account the possibility that Oxenfrey has just as much motivation. The argument doesn't really need to take that into consideration. D, fails to provide evidence that Danto Foods' prepackaged meals are not more nutritious than Oxenfrey's. That's not really necessary. The point of the argument was that Oxenfrey is nutritious. The reason it comes to that conclusion is that it says its enemies say it's not. So because they're enemies, they're therefore lying, and therefore the opposite conclusion is true. That's, once again, a flawed kind of reasoning. Answer choice E presumes, without providing justification, that Danto Foods' public relations department would not approve a draft of a report that was hostile to Danto Foods' products. This is saying that the argument assumes that Danto Foods' public relations department would not publish bad PR about Danto Foods. I think the argument does assume that, but that's not really a bad thing to assume. The LSAT is a reality-based test, and I think we can assume in reality that a PR department for a corporate firm would not want there to be bad publicity for that corporation. It's a very reasonable assumption. It's the kind of assumption you can make. Remember that time we read the very first paragraph of the introductory paragraph for a logical reasoning question? You can make very basic common sense assumptions like this, and I don't care what anyone else says in the LSAT world. It's totally fine. Go do it. Answer choice E is not a flaw. It's not a problem with this argument. So, once again, the correct answer is A. Now, if we go a little further in this section, we should see some familiar flaws. Number 17, we had that expert flaw. We discussed that in Lesson 2, where an argument takes the opinion of an expert but uses it improperly. Just because someone's smart doesn't mean they're right about everything. I think I'm very good at the LSAT. I would not know what to say if you asked me a question about, I know a little bit about economics, but not very much. I don't know anything about biology. Just because I'm good at this doesn't mean I'm good at other things. Just because I'm very smart at the LSAT doesn't mean you'd want me performing neurosurgery on you. So going for an expert it's okay. It's okay to ask the LSAT expert about the LSAT. But if you ask the LSAT expert about neurosurgery, that's not a very good idea. So it's a flaw to appeal to expert opinion improperly. If you look at 21, that's the cause and effect flaw with the minivan driver. He had a correlation that minivans are involved in less accidents, that the people who drive minivans tend to be safer drivers. The improper deduction is to think that driving a minivan causes one to be a safer driver. In fact, it's probably that a certain kind of driver uses a minivan and just happens to be a safer driver. So that's it for Section 2. Let's take a look at Section 3 of the June 2007 exam. Number 4. Pause the video and try this one on your own. The conclusion is that corporations' use of motivational posters is unlikely to achieve its intended purpose. Its purpose is to increase productivity. All employees, we learn, however, at these corporations are already motivated to work productively. So what's the problem here? The flaw is that just because they're already productive, just because they're already motivated to work productively, doesn't mean they could not be motivated more and work even more productively. Being motivated is not like a yes or no thing. There's certainly levels of motivation. So the flaw is that the argument assumes that they're already at the maximal level of productivity, and therefore the posters won't do anything. So that's described in answer choice E. Pretty easy one. I'm not going to go over the wrong answers here. You might notice at this point that some of these flaw questions have answer choices worded in a way that draws on specific content from the question, and other answer choices have language that's more abstract, like infers a cause from a correlation, or reverses sufficient and necessary. Here in this question, and in a lot of flawed reasoning questions, we have each answer choice introduced by the phrase fails to consider or takes for granted. And then I guess D, does not adequately address. So that would also be similar to fails to consider. Whenever an answer choice starts out with fails to consider or fails to exclude the possibility that, this is really like a weakening answer choice. What follows if the answer choice is correct will weaken the argument. And let's look at E. Even if employees are already motivated to work productively, motivational posters may increase that motivation. That weakens the argument. That's why E is right. So when you see that fails to consider the possibility, that's introducing information that, if correct, weakens the argument. When you see takes for granted that means assumes. So if B were correct, B would be describing an assumption that the argument made. And you can even use the negation test or the denial test when you see an answer choice introduced by takes for granted that. Let's take a look at the answer choice, see what happens when we negate it. B takes for granted that with respect to their employees' motivation to work productively, corporations that decorate their halls with motivational posters are not representative of corporations in general. So who cares? These corporations are not representative of corporations in general. The argument isn't about corporations in general. It's about those specific corporations that have motivational posters. So B would not be describing a necessary assumption and therefore incorrect. So these kinds of questions are sort of like a melange or a combination of weakening and necessary assumption. The other kind of flawed reasoning, the ones that have abstract flaws in their answer choices, I think are a little bit more difficult because they require you to go to another level and really understand the different kinds of LSAT reasoning. So we'll be looking at both of them today. Let's take a look now at number 18. Pause the video and try this one on your own. The conclusion, hence it is also likely to be widely accepted that it is sometimes morally right to obstruct the police in their work. Why? Because in all cultures, it is universally accepted that one has a moral duty to prevent members of one's family from being harmed. Thus, few would deny that if a person is known by the person's parents to be falsely accused of a crime, it would be morally right for the parents to hide the accused from the police. Hence, it is also likely to be widely accepted that it's sometimes morally right to obstruct the police in their work. Now, this is actually a pretty rare instance of an argument where the flaw doesn't come between the evidence and conclusion and doesn't come between the intermediate conclusion and the main conclusion. It actually comes between the first premise and the intermediate conclusion. That's pretty rare in the LSAT. Usually the flaw will be between the last logical point of the evidence and the main conclusion itself. But here the flaw takes place when the argument jumps from it is universally accepted that one is supposed to protect one's family to this whole thing with the police. Because those responsible for law and order, most of us believe we should have some sort of moral deference to them in some situations, I would imagine. The flaw here is that it doesn't consider that there might be other moral principles at work. The only moral principle considered is the duty to protect one's family. But then the argument jumps to a claim that says, well, you can protect your family from the police. We might, if we really liked Law and Order a lot, not the show, like, the concept of Law and Order. If we were really a Law and Order society, we might think that one always has to do whatever the police tell us, no matter what, even at the expense of our own families. I don't particularly think that, but it's possible. So the correct answer here is B. Fails to consider the possibility that other moral principles would be widely recognized as overriding any obligation to protect a family member from harm. There are other moral principles out there. So in an argument about morality, we can't just say, okay, we believe in protecting the family, therefore we can obstruct the police in their work, or we can do violent things to other families if that protects our family, sort of like mafia style. I don't know if that's necessarily something that most people or all cultures would believe in. Let's now take a look at 23. Pause the video and try this one on your own. Conclusion: clearly, these speeches are selfishly motivated and the promises made in them are unreliable. The evidence: political candidate speeches are loaded with promises and they say lots of good stuff, but they have an ulterior motive to make these promises. They want to get elected. So therefore, they're selfishly motivated and unreliable. This is quite similar to the first flaw question we did in that, okay, there's some bias, there's some selfish motivation, therefore we can't trust them at all. That's not a good argument. Just because someone's biased or just because someone has some self-interest in telling you something doesn't mean they're lying. I have some self-interest in telling you that I'm a good LSAT teacher because I want to be known as a great LSAT teacher. I don't think I'm lying about that. So it's possible to do something selfishly and still be honest about it. The correct answer, therefore, is D. The argument overlooks the fact that a promise need not be unreliable just because the person who made it has an ulterior motive for doing so. Let's take a look at the wrong answers here. A, the argument presumes without providing justification that if a person's promise is not selfishly motivated, then that promise is reliable. The argument doesn't assume that. Answer choice A is describing a very common kind of wrong answer. If we think about this argument, the argument basically assumed if something's selfishly motivated, oh, those are my initials, hey, then it's not reliable. That's what the argument assumed. That's what the correct answer points out, is that the argument overlooks that one could be selfish and reliable. What A is saying is that if someone's not selfish, someone is reliable. Now that is actually a different argument altogether. A is describing the bad negation of the assumption in the argument, and that's tempting because it has content drawn from the argument and it looks kind of like what the argument did, but the argument did not do this over here. The argument didn't say if you're not selfish, you're reliable. It said if you are selfish, you are not reliable. So we don't want an answer choice that's describing exactly the opposite of what or not exactly the opposite, I should say, but we don't want an answer choice that's describing the bad negation of what the argument did, because really answer choice A is describing a completely different argument altogether. But a lot of people are going to look at A, they're going to pick it because it looks like something the argument did, particularly if you're a little bit confused by the argument and you recognize that content from the stimulus. So I haven't said this before, but I want to say it now. Probably should have said it earlier, but answer choice A is a place where they love to put tempting answer choices in. Answer choices that draw on content from the stimulus. So if you like A, be a little bit skeptical of it, because it's very often the place where they put that really strong sucker choice, that really strong tempting wrong answer that's going to get a lot of students to pick the wrong answer and get the problem wrong. So be skeptical of those tempting answer choices in answer choice A. Correct answer here, once again, was D.